Thank you for joining us in this session. We will take a critical look at our Engaging Men and Boys work. We will look back at the evolution of our field of work, its strengths and weaknesses, and then we're going to look ahead and we'll discuss ways to strengthen this field to make it truly transformative. We will review the work of Doctors Alan Greig and Michael Flood, authors of the discussion paper, Work with Men and Boys for Gender Equality, a review of field formation, evidence base, and future directions. This paper helped to inform UN Women's flagship report, Progress of the World's Women 2019-2020, Families in a Changing World. And after that, and throughout, we're going to invite you and some really amazing global experts to weigh in on this discussion. So as a participant in this session, you will gain a few key understandings and skills, in particular, a stronger understanding of the field of work with men and boys, an awareness of the field's achievements and its conceptual blind spots and political risks, a roadmap for the future of work with men and boys, and some guidance on practical strategies for programming and policy that will truly contribute to gender transformative change. So let's get right to it. First, it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Åsa Regner, Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, and former Minister for Children, the Elderly, and Gender Equality of Sweden. Welcome, Åsa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Humberto. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is a topic I've always been extremely interested in. I was in Beijing 25 years ago, and the discussion about men's involvement in gender equality work is even older than that. I don't have to tell all of you about that. You're veterans, you know that. But I really have always felt that, you know, we have to work on this together and also gather evidence and see what works. So I'm very happy also about today's paper and the fact that the discussion will have its basis in that. And I want to thank all of you here today and all the members of the MenEngage Alliance. And I was also had the pleasure to be part of last week's discussions as well. And I think this is very timely, very important. I think that we live in a time where you mentioned the family report. I didn't write it, although it is from UN Women. I'm very proud of it. I didn't write it, so I can't take credit for it, but I think it was a very interesting report, the way it approached families and the discussion around families. And I think that we live in a world where a lot of the political debate actually evolves around that. And we have both, I think, hopeful political tendencies in relation to a changing world towards gender equality, but we also see a lot of resistance. And I think that for us to move forward when it comes to gender equality efforts, we need to know what works and discuss how we can scale up efforts which actually had a good result in relation to achieving gender equality. And I think that the paper is very helpful in doing that. I also believe, and I think that when I was a minister in Sweden for both social services and social affairs, as well as gender equality, I already had lots of years thinking about this with me. But I also saw that although I was leading this work in a country which ranks the highest or very high when we measure gender equality in the world, I could still see the difficulties to scale up work that was being done in order to promote gender equality through work with men and boys. That country, Sweden, is one example of a country with a long history of these kinds of this kind of work, but still it was very difficult to both scale them up, but also to create some kind of common understanding of what the different projects and programs in municipality, etc., actually meant for progress. And I think that now moving into, for us, our next strategic plan, which is a very technical step perhaps, but it will guide our work for the next 4 years. I think we have the opportunity together with knowledgeable people like yourselves, together with the women's movements and together with member states, to actually try to do both the coming together when it comes to understanding the knowledge that we have around men and boys, and also to do some of the scaling up in UN Women's work for gender equality, but by including work on men and boys in a more systematic and knowledgeable way. So I am really delighted to be able to introduce this session, because the paper that we are talking about is one that UN Women commissioned from Michael Flood and Alan Greig, and it provides a critical review of the field of working with men and boys today. And I think that the Ubuntu Symposium, the second week, as you mentioned, really which aims to make men and masculinities work more effectively and impactful for gender justice, which also wants to strengthen a global community, understand intersectionality in the light of men and boys and masculinity work, really is needed to meet the need for gender equality that we see. We saw that already when we took stock 25 years after Beijing, but also since we know that inequalities have been exacerbated by the COVID time, the COVID year almost, that we have almost behind us. So the paper takes stock of where we are and provides evidence of what has worked and what has not worked, and also discusses that some interventions reached one goal but not another. Why is that, and so on? What could have been done differently, and what are the opportunities to work on with that knowledge, but also tweak in order to be more to reach the targets we want. So it makes recommendations to improve efforts. And it also suggests, very importantly, that it says that these kinds of interventions can support social change over long term, and but it also that it needs to be done with accountability to women and girls. It needs to have that balance. And also the paper goes into the challenge that the fact that this kind of work often is small scale, as I mentioned before, and it focuses on changing behaviors and attitudes many times of individual men and boys. And the paper says this is important work, but we need to make this more to upgrade this on a bigger scale, and also discuss the structures around this in another way. From UN Women's side, the organization launched a few years ago the so-called He for She campaign, which we believe has actually offered a platform to discuss these issues with men's leadership in favor of gender equality. But we also now feel that we have to fill that kind of work with more of knowledge-based contents in order to achieve actual change. And I think that within the He for She campaign, we have gotten a lot of much needed attention, but there were also challenges around that initiative. And now we want to move into, or to fill that, as I said, or build another ground when it comes to work with men and boys and masculinities to support everything we do. We also, as you know, from UN Women's side, always work together with young activists, women and men. We work with the women's movement, we work with the feminist movement, we work with member states, we work with the private sector. We would do so also going into the future with something called generation equality, and the 6 action coalitions where we have pointed out areas where we think we together in these constituencies need to do more to actually reach gender equality. The stock taking we did after 25 years after Beijing showed us that there is still a lot to do. And those of you who have studied the Beijing platform know that the ambition with that platform was not only to point out 12 random areas which were important for gender equality. The whole idea with that negotiation between the UN member states was actually to create or to reach a power shift from men to women to achieve more of gender justice and to achieve gender equality in the world. And that power shift has not happened. Although there are positive signs. We know, for example, that we do have much more of legislation when it comes, for instance, to men's violence against women in the majority of the countries. We also, for example, know that over 90 countries in the world, and this is also something that is discussed in the family report, over 90 countries have some kind of provision for men to spend time with their newborn children or very young children, some kind of parental leave for fathers. The problem, however, is that these reforms and the legislation, they are underfunded, they are not implemented, there are not systems to implement these efforts, and we still have not reached that power shift, and we have also not been able to engage men and boys and scale up the work that could actually really change societies. So I'm very, very eager to listen to today's discussion, and I'm very happy to be able to be part of this session today. Thank you so much, and over to you, Humberto.
Thank you so much, Åsa, for those wonderful welcoming remarks. You are right. There is a true opportunity to scale up this work and to really truly understand what has worked and what hasn't, and learn from those lessons, and to do that in an accountable way with the women's movement, the feminist movement, the diverse social movements around the globe, and do it together with youth and with multiple sectors. So thank you for your leadership, and thank you to UN Women for commissioning this work and for your support. And we look forward to continuing this journey together with you. So thank you for joining us today. Much appreciated. All right, so onwards we go, and thanks again, Åsa, for that. So I would like to quickly invite all of our presenters to the virtual floor and introduce them very quickly. You can see their bios and read more about them and their work in the Ubuntu app or on the website. It would take too long to go through everyone's bios, but I would like to quickly introduce everyone first with our presenters. Alan Greig, who's an independent gender specialist based in the USA, and Michael Flood, an associate professor with Queensland University of Technology in Australia. And then our really great discussants, Jean Kamitare, program director, Urgent Action Fund Africa, Charbel Maydaa, with ILGA UKRI and GCRF Gender, Justice and Security Hub of the UK Research and Innovation. Gloria Careaga Perez, a social psychologist with the Faculty of Psychology in the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And finally, Urvashi Gandhi, Director of Global Advocacy at Breakthrough India. So now I would like to turn it over to our presenters, to Alan and Michael, who will take us through a summary of the report. So let's begin with Alan. Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Humberto, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to share my screen now and get up my presentation. So thanks again. Thank you to Åsa for those welcoming remarks, and particularly the emphasis on how we do bring about this power shift at scale that we're all interested in working on. Our thanks go to UN Women for commissioning the paper. and to MenEngage for this opportunity to present it and discuss it with you. And also, obviously, thanks to everyone here who's joined us for this conversation. So, as Ossa said, the report was commissioned for the Families in a Changing World report that was issued last year. You'll note this paper is only now being published this year. So that's Michael and my fault for taking too long to write the paper, such that it would have coincided with the UN report last year. And we've apologized profusely for that. But at last it has seen the light of day. And we're excited to discuss it with you. So the commission to write the report was the initial reason. We did feel it was important, kind of 25 years after the Beijing conference, when Work with Men was kind of announced to the world as an important piece of work with gender equality, that 25 years on from that would be important to kind of take stock. And I think during this time as well, there have been not only we've seen the growth of the field of work with men and boys on gender equality, but also a growing number of critiques of this work and concerns expressed about its directions and priorities. And we wanted to kind of reflect on those and see what sense we made of those. It's also clearly a time, as we all know, of resurgent male supremacies, if I put it that way. We started writing this report at the end of 2017, so in the first year of the Trump presidency, and we'd already seen the rise to power of a number of overtly misogynistic political leaders and a more visible and vocal misogyny in public speech online and offline. And we wanted to take stock of that. And, you know, Michael and I have both been doing this work for a long time. So this is also a personal kind of self-reflection on the work that we've been doing and its limitations and what we think about where it could go. So through the report kind of takes this concept of the field, which we think of as a fabric of organizations, publications, agendas and actions committed to men for gender equality. So we know it's not just men who are working in the field. Lots of women, people of other gender identities are doing this work. It tends to be oriented towards how do we get more men thinking about and working on gender equality. So we called it the Men for Gender Equality field. And it's clearly grown over the years. There might be many ways to measure that growth, but one way to look at it would be simply to look at the MenEngage Symposia from 2009 to 2014 to this year to see the growth literally in terms of the numbers of people and organizations involved in working on these issues and writing on them and participating in the conversations at the symposia. There's been a growth over this period quite markedly. The work that's been done has ranged across a number of issues, most dominantly sexual and reproductive health and rights, gender-based violence, violence against women, fatherhood, and perhaps more recently in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And there's also been some growth of the evidence base for this work. And this paper was partly commissioned to contribute to that evidence base. There's been a series of meta reviews trying to unpick what we think we mean by gender transformative and to show that that work is being gender transformative. But what in kind of looking at this growth of the field and the evidence base, we in the report look at three kinds of reflections that we think are useful to think about in order to think more critically about the field. And that is in terms of category errors, the category of men itself and its possibilities and limitations, some problems of theory, and here we focus on social norms theory and the way it's been applied, and issues with strategy and how we think about kind of how the NGO relationship between NGO form and movement strategies. So I'll go through these one by one. And bear in mind, this is quite a long report, so I'm having to rush through quite a lot of material here, so I apologize if I start speeding up. Category errors was the first section of the report, and that looks at this category of men and its problems. So there has been a conversation within the field, I think, about how we think about what do we call the men who were involved in this work. And for many years, the terminology used was that of the male ally, men being allies to women in their struggles for gender equality. In recent years, there's been a question about whether it's better to think of men as co-beneficiaries. The report written for the 2014 symposium looked at that language and suggested that language. But there has been also a pushback against that, feeling that there's a slight danger of an emerging parallel system, as COFEM puts it, of work with men and boys emerging in and developing in parallel with work on gender justice with women and girls, and also a danger in that of recentering men and men's voices and leadership. So these are the critiques that have been emerging in recent years. I think one way the field has tried to manage those critiques is kind of been operationally. So how do you manage this tension between focusing on men's patriarchal power versus the harms of patriarchal masculinities to men themselves? And sometimes that's been managed in terms of when do you bring up some issues compared to others in order to focus on the hard issues, but also encourage men into that conversation. But what we're suggesting in the paper is that there are also deeper questions about the political subjectivity that is invoked when this category of men is used. And here we draw attention to the importance of thinking of men not as kind of just out there in the world as a natural thing, but as the term shows up in all sorts of reports and program plans and discourses in the field, it's constructing the reality it purports to describe. So the men category is doing some work, and we want to think about the work that category of men is doing. And what we suggest is that with this category of men, the field calls into being the political subjectivity of men as agents of change in the project of gender transformation, at the same time as abstracting actual men from the relations of power which are the object of that transformation. So the ways in which the category of men, by homogenizing men as a single category, abstracts men's lived experiences and relationships to power from those power relations. And I'll get into that now in a bit more detail. And I think one of the main ways that it does this, which we suggest, is that it sets a domestic frame for both understanding the problems of men and for situating responses and interventions to those problems. This domestic framing of work with men started early. So James Wolfensohn, in introducing the importance of working with men at the Beijing conference in 1995, James Wolfensohn at that point was the head of the World Bank. He talked about, to bring about real improvement in the quality of women's lives, men must change and action must begin at home. Now, of course, the importance of action beginning at home was a key tenet of second wave feminism from the 1970s onwards, with the notion of the personal is political. So that the change in the domestic sphere was one aspect of challenges to patriarchal structures across people's lived experiences. But I think it's also important to understand this emphasis on the domestic more in relation to the emergence of a discourse of family values, which has its roots in both conservative and neoliberal thinking. So the paper goes into this in some detail, but from the late 1970s onwards, you get the emergence of a family values discourse within neoliberal and conservative ideology in the US, the UK, and elsewhere, which focuses on an ethic of responsibility, both moral and economic. And that's from Melinda Cooper's book on family values. So here, far from the domestic being the site of struggle to change structures of patriarchal power. The domestic here is the site whereby personal and familial responsibility is exercised to preserve existing neoliberal and conservative arrangements of power. So it's a privatization of responsibility. So we go from a structural analysis of problems of patriarchy to an analysis or to an emphasis on personal responsibility. And I think the ways in which this work with men in relation to care and the care economy offers some glimpses of the way this has played out. So if you look at fatherhood, the growth of fatherhood programming, and you can see the rise of fatherhood programming in the US, certainly from the mid 80s, perhaps early 90s maybe, linked to welfare reform proposals. That, well, I think it's important to understand that fatherhood programming in relation to this privatization of responsibility, such that the problems of the care economy get attributed to irresponsible masculinity. And the solution...
Alan, you have 1 minute.
Crikey. Okay. Need to split it. Okay. So Men in Care is a situation where we have this problem of the domestication of the problems in terms of failed masculinities. And in the course of that, you get an erasure of class and race issues, which are linked to the problems of the care economy. I'm not sure. I think I need a couple more minutes, Humberto. Theory problems.
Fine by me.
Okay. Okay. I don't want to be too brutal in the summary. If those are the category areas, then theory problems we're situating in terms of social norms theory. So the Men for Gender Equality field has been critiqued for failing to get beyond the personal. As also mentioned, we need a power shift at the structural level. This failure to get beyond the personal is a little surprising, because a lot of the roots of work with men on gender justice and gender equality is rooted in political struggles. Whether you look at South Africa, Nicaragua, Indonesia, India, the UK, the US, work with men for gender equality started in the context of broader political struggles against patriarchal and other power relations. But over the course of the last 25 years or more, you can see, certainly in relation to the ways that issues of violence are talked about, there's been a shift from structural to behavioral accounts of violence, and an increasing turn to social norms theory as a way to explain behavioral violence. And I think what the paper looks at is the ways in which that social norms theory conflates sociological accounts of normalization of power hierarchies with social psychological accounts of men's assessments of other men's expectations of them. And in that kind of conflation of sociological and social psychological, some things get excluded from the framing of violence, not least different types of violence that are included, such that state violence, institutionalized forms of violence tend to drop out of the picture, and also linked to that, the forms of action that could be taken to challenge that violence. And lastly, clearly over the years, there's been a big debate within feminist movements themselves about how to challenge structures of patriarchy, and concerns that the NGOization of feminism, which has also been charted from the Beijing conference onwards, has led to a depoliticization. There's been some pushback against that critique by scholars and researchers and activists, noting the ways in which feminism has been side-streamed into different social movements and social justice struggles. And certainly in the last few years, you've seen a resurgence of feminist activism on a whole range of issues. So we need to think about the ways in which our masculinities work does or does not contribute to that movement building. And I think there are ways in which the depoliticized nature of masculinities work, linked to this social norms theory and the and the category of men, which erases class and race issues amongst men, plays into that depoliticization and limits the ability of the field to contribute to movement building. The paper raises the issue, and I think it warrants further exploration as to whether that depoliticization is also linked to the NGO form itself within much of the work that Men has done. And I think that's worth more conversation. But it does talk about the importance of moving towards more accountable movement building as being central to the tasks that we now face. So perhaps I'll leave it there and hand over to Michael. Sorry for slightly going over time.
So we turn now to the question of evidence. And in the engaging men field, there's a growing expectation that we will gather evidence, that we will collect rigorous data on the effectiveness of our programs and our policies. So what kind of data counts? Well, the gold standard in some fields has been the randomized controlled trial, the RCT. And in the engaging men field, there's been an emphasis on experimental and quasi-experimental studies as representing the strongest form of evidence. But we argue that RCTs and experimental studies are not the only valid ways to collect evidence about the impact of our efforts. Often they're impractical. Other forms of data also are important. And it's vital to gather data on the broader impact of our work, its impacts in the wider communities where our efforts take place, and its impacts among participants and others over longer time periods. Now, in the report, we summarise the evidence base. And one of the things you quickly notice is the growth of interventions and the growth of scholarship about those interventions. There's sort of large numbers of published studies, or increasingly large numbers, and in turn increases in systematic reviews and meta-analyses of those. So what does this evidence tell us? Sorry, I keep forgetting I need to say, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, lovely, thank you. So what can we conclude? First, it is possible to make change. Well-designed interventions can increase men's and boys' gender equitable attitudes, behaviours and relations. Now, in many forums, I focus just on that point. I say, look, we can make change. On violence prevention, for example, well-designed programs can decrease men's violent supportive attitudes and even reduce their actual perpetration of violence. But our report is intended to be a critical stocktake. So what are the limitations of this evidence base? First, if interventions are making change, often it's only small level change. Most interventions are focused on change only at the levels of individuals and relationships, and few address social and structural factors. Second, many interventions aimed at engaging men and boys are not evaluated. And when they are, they tend to be quantitative, short-term, and to give little attention to impacts on gender relations. Third, we simply don't know about whether and how our work with men and boys can shift structures and systems. Next slide, please. So the final section of our report identifies future directions for the field. Now, I confess, Alan and I are both academically trained, and perhaps because of that, we've spent more time on the problem and less time on the solutions. And this section is shorter than it should be. Nevertheless, we encourage 4 key directions for the Men for Gender Equality field. And the first is to focus on the masculinity of hegemony. Our work must pay focused attention to the gendered operations of power and injustice. Now, we phrase this in terms of focusing on the masculinity of hegemony. The notion of hegemonic masculinities highlights the dominant ideologies which naturalise, normalise, and conceal male dominance. So we have to address how gender inequalities are maintained through widespread ideologies of masculinity. But the notion of the masculinity of hegemony also highlights that often it's constructions of masculinity that sustain social hierarchies and patterns of injustice. Politics, for example, is often about masculinity, in many ways about masculinity. Men, privileged men, monopolise political leadership. Politics is shaped by masculine norms. Elections are often contests over different forms of masculinity. Voting is shaped by sexist hostilities and perceived threats to masculinity. Right-wing authoritarian parties and movements draw support from appeals to masculine values, and masculinities are used to maintain elite rule. So part of the field's work should be to challenge this and to find ways, for example, to lessen young men's recruitment into anti-feminist ideologies and communities, their misogynist radicalisation. Next slide, please. Our report second calls for pushing for political as well as policy change. Now, one of the key tools in the Engaging Men field is training. We run workshops. I've run workshops. We train and educate people. These are important. But if we're serious about making progress towards gender equality, workshops are not enough. Alan and I argued that we need other strategies as well. Engaging Men organisations should support women's rights advocacy to do with politics and governance and try to increase women's political representation. We should try to increase men's support for gender equality measures. We should work directly with male political actors, with politicians, party members and civil servants. And we should directly challenge anti-feminist backlash. We also have to challenge institutional inaction and impunity and push for macro-level accountability from leaders and systems. Next slide, please. Third, the report calls for more movement and less field. To put it simply, work with men and by men should be more strongly oriented towards building movements for social change. We should mobilise men in support of women's rights advocacy and in linked struggles for gender, economic and social justice. And we've got two further recommendations here. We have to rethink how we work on key areas, and Alan's given you some sense of that. How we work on notions of care, on practices of violence and so on. Second, we have to reflect critically, continue to reflect critically on how we frame men and the work of engaging men. Finally, next slide, please. Finally, all of this requires that we reorient evidence and evidence-based practice towards social change. Yes, let's keep asking. Let's ask what works, what makes change. Let's continue to build an evidence base, but one that is more politically informed, more structurally minded. So the Engaging Men field is now well established around the world. Our UN Women report provides a critical stocktake of its achievements and its limitations, and we identify key ways forward to make transformative social change. Next slide, please. So it's time now for your reflections. It's time for your thoughts on the report, whether you've read it or not, on what you've heard today, and on our future directions. And there are two questions we want you to consider in these breakout rooms. You'll only have 15 minutes. I know that's a very short period, but in those 15 minutes, we want you to discuss the two questions you can see in front of you. Is the report's assessment or what you've heard of that assessment today fair? Is it an accurate one, a fair assessment? Second, what do you see as the most important future directions and priorities for the Men for Gender Equality field? We've given you some further instructions in front of you. One key thing we want you to do is when you begin in your breakout rooms, choose a facilitator and someone to take notes and someone who will report back, a rapporteur, someone who will report back to the large group, and they will be reporting back by posting a summary of your points, particularly one key point would be ideal, at least one key point to the chat box. That's the extent of my instructions. Humberto, shall I hand back to you before we put people in their rooms?
Thank you, Michael, for that. Thank you for your presentation, and thank you, Alan, as well, for your introduction. Let's get right to it. Let's go into these breakout rooms and let's digest all this amazing information, and then let's come back together to discuss further. So see you in the breakout rooms.
Then, just so that we can continue, so building on to what was shared, I think one of the things, as was mentioned by the presenters, that we are seeing in this field is, sort of lack of understanding around the clarity of the vision when we work or engage boys and men in this work. And especially when looking at the indicators and so on, most of the development projects generally tend to look at the number of men and boys, though those have been involved in a number of activities or campaigns they have been doing, and do not necessarily go into deep understanding of what is it that we are trying to achieve by this engagement? And that remains on in itself a challenge. And also one of the fields that we have learned is especially what Osa was mentioning around the he for she. One thing that we have also seen and heard from the feminist movement is the approach that has been used with this agents of change or champions model do not really help in advancing and relating this area of work to the broader feminist movement. And there has been quite a lot of pushback as well to that approach recently. And a number of those who are working in this field have now started reflecting on how do we move beyond, the champions model is a very good entry point to start recruiting those men and boys who may not have shown any interest in the beginning, but that movement should continue to push for more critical self-reflection of the engagement of boys and men. So that's what I wanted to add a little bit on to build onto what was shared. So open to others if you'd like to join in and share your thoughts.
Yo agregaría, por ejemplo, que una de las cosas que se vienen observando en el último tiempo aquí en Argentina es el surgimiento de algunos institutos de masculinidades que generalmente están asociados a universidades. De cualquier manera, es decir, es de donde surgen las primeras propuestas, los primeros talleres, los primeros replanteos en términos de jurídicos, tanto sea en el ámbito legislativo como en el ámbito de la justicia, pero cuando uno tiene que pensar ya más en términos, si se quiere, de una masa crítica, es decir, de un grupo considerable de varones que se cuestionan y al mismo tiempo cuestionan en el sentido de acompañar a las mujeres, eso todavía dista muchísimo. Por ahí al principio creo que lo dije un poco más enredado, ahora creo que por ahí quizás se entienda un poco mejor. No hay todavía una organización que, digamos, que marque como un quiebre y cree un nuevo paradigma. No deja de ser una discusión que se da en ámbitos académicos y que trata de dar determinadas peleas en algunos ámbitos, no más que eso.
Yeah, thank you, Facundo. That's a brilliant point. Maybe Khadi Diatau, sorry, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your name. I see you have added your reflection on the chat. Maybe if you can, elaborate that a bit more.
Oui, merci. Je ne sais pas si vous me recevez parce que mon internet n'est pas stable.
We can hear you very well.
Ok, ce que je voudrais souligner dans cette discussion, nous au Sénégal par exemple, c'est l'exemple que je maîtrise le mieux, nous les organisations de femmes qui essayons de combattre ce fléau-là, faire en sorte que les rôles soient bien partagés au sein des ménages, qu'il y a une équité ou bien au moins un équilibre. On ne nous comprend pas parce que dans nos sociétés traditionnelles, surtout qui sont très conservateurs, les gens ne comprennent pas quand on parle d'un homme qui doit faire des tâches ménagères, par exemple. Donc, autant d'exemples de ce genre qui nous causent trop de soucis et qui fait que généralement, nos activités sont rejetées, ne sont pas soutenues par les communautés de base. Et l'autre aspect également, c'est au niveau de la législation, la légifération. Il y a beaucoup d'entreprises actuellement qui n'intègrent pas encore les congés de paternité. Donc, on n'accepte pas que les hommes aient cette possibilité-là quand l'épouse a un enfant ou bien quand eux-mêmes ils choisissent d'aider leur femme, de prendre des congés de paternité. Donc, autant de questions qui, pour moi, devraient être mises dans les priorités pour aider les organisations que nous sommes et qui sommes en train de nous battre dans nos communautés pour faire rétablir cet équilibre-là au niveau de nos sociétés. Donc, c'est ça les exemples que je voudrais partager avec le groupe. Merci beaucoup.
Looks like we are back to the bigger room. So over to you, Humberto.
Thank you, Lakshman, and welcome back, everyone. I think we're all back in the room now. We're slowly getting back, and I hope you had some great discussions in your small breakouts. And just a reminder for the note taker, the person that offered to take notes, to please input the one key point that was shared during your discussion. Just please add that to the chat box so that we can take up the discussion right now. All right, so we do have one first question that maybe we can start with so that everybody has a chance to input their key points. And that was a question to Alan and Michael in regards to their presentation. And that is, given the range of critical reflections available, how did you identify those three categories, the categories that you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, in particular, Alan? How did you identify those and what factors contribute to this categorization?
So I think that's from Russ, right? Thanks, Russ, for that. I think what we were trying to do was kind of look at some deeper underlying issues which might be useful to think about in terms of the critiques, because I think I kind of read quite a lot about the ways in which some critiques are kind of managed operationally, like I said, in terms of, you know, finding that balance between talking to men about patriarchal power versus the harms of masculinity to them. And we were interested in looking more kind of fundamentally at, are there some things about the way the field has set itself up in terms of the homogenized category of men, for example, or this reliance on social norms theorizing that we need to think about in terms of what that makes possible and what that doesn't make possible in terms of the work we can do. Yeah. So trying to look a bit deeper into what maybe we need to question some of the things I think we just take for granted. Michael, you want to add to that?
I mean, there's bits and pieces of critique in the paper that, you know, we've seen elsewhere in earlier MenEngage and other materials. But I think one of the things that's distinctive about the report is kind of looking at how the field itself has taken shape. Its processes, its structures, its processes and structures, and what that means, good and bad, for the kind of work that we can do.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan and Michael. I'm seeing some contributions coming in through the chat box, so thanks everybody for including those. So I will read through some of these quickly and then invite Michael and Alan to weigh in as well. So from Nikki, one of the things from our group was that we felt it was really important to have personal and individual change as well as structural change. And it is important not to dismiss the former. So actually, this came up in my group as well, that we must work at all levels. From Jan, we need to focus on the recommendations towards system change. Not having read the paper, we did not really go into the analysis as such, but agree with the gist presented. Again, relatable recommendations here. And we invite everyone to read the report for much more in-depth analysis, of course. So from room 10, accurate and give complexity more unpacking would be helpful. More work is needed in working with political actors and in policy change and systems change, such as in economics. A really good point. So maybe I'll pause here, and Michael and Alan, your thoughts so far on these points.
Michael, do you want to jump off?
The one about personal and individual change is, yeah, I think a valuable one, and it would. We don't want the paper to be read as saying, you know, making individual change is irrelevant, or changing individual men's, you know, sense of self and their relations with their female partners or male partners or children or those around them is irrelevant. It was a point about the need for our efforts to also include systemic and structural change. But I think we should continue to assume that one of the key tasks for any man involved in this work, particularly those of us who are advocates and educators, is to look critically at our own lives and relations and our own gender equitable practice.
But also, I think not to kind of necessarily juxtapose those two things as distinct or entirely separate, because I think when men get involved in activism for structural change, that is also a process, or often a process of personal change, or requires a process of personal change for those men themselves. So that this kind of politicizing the work is, in my experience, just speaking personally, is also about a process of personal change which you go through to be involved in that political activism.
Yeah, such great points, Michael and Alan. And certainly knowing in my experience in working with men in the field is you often have to meet them where they're at and work alongside with them to bring them to that point where they can become advocates and they can start working alongside with us towards system change. So that initial behavior and attitudinal change with helping them understand the end goal of feminism and gender equality and so forth is really key in building their understanding, their capacity, their know-how, their motivation and inspiration to work towards systemic change. So we must not lose sight of those early interventions as well. So a few more key points. Our group discussed the difference in the field, global north versus global south, and how perhaps in the field included those in power that could affect real change. Example, use what works in other contexts and engage politicians, etc. Tom wrote, how do we affect and measure systemic change? The same conversations are happening in many movements. We might have to build more links across movements. One of the key focuses of our group was recentering queer and genderqueer voices in work on masculinities and avoiding prescriptive boundaries of left, right-wing, man, woman that often reinforce divisive hegemonic norms. So a couple of thoughts here in terms of the challenge in evaluating and demonstrating change at that level, and also the importance of working across social movements. And this came up in my group as well. We need to remove the silos that exist between the gender equality movement, the racial justice movement, indigenous peoples movement, environment, and so forth. So how do we best evaluate systemic change? And how do we build stronger links across diverse social movements? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in terms of the evidence, the report discusses the need, and as Michael said, we need to kind of expand our notion of the evidence base. And I think that, there's more to say about that and more to kind of talk about that in terms of how to do that. But I think that the pressures around producing evidence of what works has tended to produce or reproduce certain kinds of programs and not others. And I think we need to kind of look at that. I think it's a great point about the recentering queer and genderqueer voices. I think the domestic framing that I was alluding to and this kind of category of men has tended to produce a cisgendered heteronormative, or it's tended to reinforce a cisgendered heteronormative gender binary of men and women who are relating heterosexually. And I think that's clearly a problem. So that category of men needs rethinking from a trans perspective as well, in terms of trans masculinities, for example.
Alan, can I ask you, given that we call for, and others in the chat have called for, the need to mobilize men to build links with other, justice-oriented social movements, do you see risks in doing that? Or do you think there will be challenges in building those links between, differing social justice movements with agendas that may be in tension in some ways?
Yeah, well, I think that's the movement building challenge always, right? We're figuring out where are the the tensions, the different understandings of relations of power and what to do about them. But I think we need to be more in the conversation than we are at the moment, which takes, I mean, I think this notion of side streaming is really, Sonia Alvarez's notion of side streaming is really interesting in terms of the way that, different social movements have a clear feminist, dimension to them. Black Lives Matter was founded by three queer women of color. So there's a queer politics there, there's a feminist politics there, and there's a racial politics there. And I think, so one thing to do, I think, for us as a field is to be more explicit about our queer politics, our racial politics, as well as our gender politics. You know what I mean? So only by being more clear about that for ourselves can we then be talking to other people about common agendas.
Really great point. More clear, more visible, more representative, more advocating for strongly in partnership with and in applying accountability as well towards diverse social movements. So thank you for that. A few more comments from Lars. We had agreement from our group that the report is very relevant and timely with a welcome level of critical perspective. Many felt the priority to focus on movement and building alliances, noting also linking with activists within institutions. Many also felt that it is important to focus on backlash, but also noting that many countries and leaders may be in a type of silent majority in favor of progressive change. Leaders, including all of us, need to be more explicit about why we support reforms, etc. And then from Osvaldo, yes, speakers warned of the failing to get beyond the personal, but we also have to warn the failing to forget the personal. So it's both beyond and including the personal. So to Alan's point, my experience of mobilizing and organizing men is that very often by mobilizing men to engage in social change can be as effective and sometimes more effective as a way to educate them than a traditional educational model. And then from Sarah, the stats produced by WEF don't reflect reality. If sexual crimes and other crimes were included in equality reports, they might properly reflect not only gender equality, but also real equality. And from Osvaldo again, more from our group, binary thinking constraints this gender work. Beware of the trap of gender binary. Difficult to speak on equity because top-down political environment in India. We need to bridge feminist perspectives and the work with men and more accountability. Alan, Michael, responses to those?
There's so much rich thinking. I honestly, I'd like to copy and paste the chat into a Word document, but as other people have noted, it's impossible for some reason. But there's some real insight there about all kinds of things, including about the challenges of evidence itself, that the kinds of evidence that are seen as legitimate, the processes through which evidence is produced themselves can limit what we've called for, which is reorienting evidence towards political change, towards structural change, and so on. So there's work to do, not only in building links with social movements, in engaging men and acknowledging the diversity among men and others, but also in the kind of corridors of scholarship and political power too, if we're to orient the engaging men field more strongly towards social change. I'm conscious of time and not wanting to play facilitator, but I'm looking forward to hearing from the discussants as well.
All right, so discussants, panelists, Jean, Charbel, Gloria, and Urvashi, would you like to jump in here as well and share your thoughts on one or two of these comments so far?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael and Alan, for this report. It's really excellent. I'm speaking as an African feminist who has engaged from community, national, regional, global level, and looked at this work over many years, beginning with suspicion, critique, etc., etc. kaleidoscope of emotions, feelings, attitudes towards the work, but noting that it's important that we engage men and women for gender justice. First, I like the framing of men for gender equality, or the field of men for gender equality, as opposed to MenEngage. I feel it makes the political goal clear. I then like the way that you structured the report and framed it in the history, bringing out the important point of domestication. I do agree with colleagues, though, that as we move away from focus on individual and personal change, we shouldn't forget that that's important. It's also a site of change. Actually, life is mutually reinforcing across the social ecology. So I agree with colleagues that that's a point that should be noted, and it's important. I do also agree with your point that a focus on that, of course, learning from women's work, but a focus on individual change doesn't necessarily create that gender transformations that we are seeking. I also liked the point of allies, co-beneficiaries, that whole discussion on that framing. And I reflected on framing that can reinforce patriarchal privilege as I read that, and I thought it was an important point for people who are doing this work. What is an ally? What's a co-beneficiary? And to you, Humberto, does appealing to men and finding them where they are make them even more? We are the gatekeepers of power, because as I've said, I work even at community level, and those are some of the discussions that then emerge. Protectionist, we are the gatekeepers of power, and we need to be engaged, so on and so forth. I really like that the report inspires politicized movement building work, moving from a single issue programming or movement building to working across all the oppressive systems that are mutually reinforcing. To pick an example, we have the challenges we have with COVID because of racialized capitalism and other isms that you can think about. But of course, now gender injustice has intersected with it, looking at the high levels of violence that have come across. So I really like that this report is emphasizing and looking at that, not forgetting my earlier point. I feel the recommendations are on point. And I wouldn't pick, as we discussed in the groups which recommend, I wouldn't pick which takes precedence over the other. I would actually like them to be taken as mutually reinforcing and put out to the world to engage simultaneously, because I don't think one would lead to the other three. I think that all the recommendations would need to be taken into consideration at the same time. Yeah, of course, it wouldn't be me without putting some buts. I feel like I would have liked a bit more on the contestations with the feminist movement around this work. There was some about it, but I would have liked a bit more on that, because that's a bit of a hindrance to the progress of the work. So I would have liked a bit more about that and how to engage with that, a recommendation on that. I know we've talked about cross-movement building, but I would have liked a bit more. I would have also liked a bit more emphasis on accountability of all movements, but also accountability of privilege in any form and any way. I did like, though, that it pointed out within the report the importance of men supporting women's leadership, supporting political leadership, political change, which involves women, and also standing up with movements at times when backlash is at its highest, and standing out and speaking out and saying something. And I hope those are points that will be taken into consideration. Lastly, I couldn't help but think of the work I know at community level and reflecting on how these really great analysis and very comprehensive report, how it will translate all the way up to programming at that level. Because a lot of the times we have great philosophical and practice discussions at global and regional levels, but how they then manifest at national and community level is different. How they are understood is different. How you then cannot speak about women for 2 minutes without someone asking about men, pitting men against women. I kid you not, it's 2 to 3 minutes. Then you'll be asked, what about men? And men are being victimized, and so many discussions. So all those contestations are actually addressed within this report. So I'm wondering how we are going to translate it to practice. I don't know if that's a question to UN Women or to MenEngage Alliance, or both, or to all of us. Because within those contestations is even funding. I'm working with a women's fund, Urgent Action Fund Africa. Within those contestations is even funding and the challenges of privilege, and how, if one is privileged and one is seen as oppressed, where does sentiments and support go? Otherwise, I reiterate that thank you so much for this report. It was really helpful, really comprehensive, and on point.
Thank you so much, Jean. Wonderful points there. And I couldn't agree more with your question, which I think should be posed to all of us. How do we move from theory to practice? How do we incorporate these wonderful principles and guidelines into our everyday practice at all levels? So I think this is the work ahead of us, to figure that out, to share best practices, promising practices, knowledge and skills and so forth. So thank you very much for that. I would love to hear next from Charbel.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me also. Well, actually, this paper really elaborates on the evidence-based and evidence-building needed practices towards engaging men and boys, which is essential while developing approaches and/or programs, where the main and most significant result is in engaging boys and men in social change programs. This reveals the importance of such programming in altering the cycles of violence towards women, meaning that prevention and intervention programs need to be designed through holistic and participatory methods on individual, community, family, and policy level. In other words, knowledge, research to policy. But and now, but as my colleague, she mentioned before, how we can translate this into in our real work in the field. And a lot of organizations, women's organizations, they believe in engaging men in to end violence against women or for gender equality or equity, etc. But the translation of your findings, guys, into a project sometimes gets lost, and sometimes it's really gets lost in a very bad way. And I will talk a little bit, if you allow me, about it. For me, we should really know, we should really highlight to whom are we giving the leadership to end violence against women. And for me, I believe it always should be for the women themselves, not for men to take the lead. And sometimes with some organizations, there is a swift here. So let's go first about deconstructing binary understanding of gender and find ways to fight against the intersectionality effects of the patriarchal system on women, girls, boys, and LGBTIQ plus community, and integrating all aspects of the Human Rights Convention and not prioritizing some of its aspects over others. It's always the time to tackle all the human rights articles, since the cost effective on the following level: economical, environmental, social, psychological, ecological, etc. Yet it's more effective when all entities, local and international organizations, coordinate together to advocate for this cause towards our main enemy, the patriarchal system. And I believe that there is a need to work in parallel with LGBTIQ plus individuals to raise awareness on tackling the patriarchal values controlled / set by men, and how it affects our fight against inequality and inequity in all its form within our society. Engaging men is not only about, and we should we always put pressure on this, we always talk about this with all people who believe in engagement, and I do believe, of course, in engaging men, but we should believe also engagement is not only about anger management. It's crucial to work under the umbrella of harm reduction approach, but also engagement and boys should not give them the authority alone to either end nor start a violence act without any feelings of guilt, but to let them understand the innate privilege given to them by our sexist culture, norms, and religion. Engagement is the most affected valuable population, our communities, women, children, and LGBTIQ+, in settings of approaches, methods through active participation is essential. This developed quality prevention and intervention programs by the most affected and not least affected men or religious leaders. Why I'm talking about this? Because to give an example, like we have a huge campaign in Lebanon about like let's engage men to end violence against women, and then in the whole publicity thing, etc. On the end, it's like it's less one. It says that like it's up to you, or it's up to you to start. So it's up to you to end the violence. As a recommendation from your reports are really amazing. The findings, I found them really amazing. The approach, everything. But sometimes we need to work more on how to take this recommendation and go to really people who are working in the field, NGOs specifically, and you mentioned this in your report, the NGOization, what you call it, and yes, and to go to NGOs who are really they can do a change if it's the right way to tackle this issue. And it's worth mentioning that it's time to deconstruct the traditional gender biases of male-defined models of leadership through mitigating the use of any absolute man-led approaches or models. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charbel, for sharing your insights. And you speak of the need to have greater accountability across the movement, and in particular to LGBTQI communities. So thank you for reinforcing that point. And just as a reminder to all participants, please do share your insights, your questions, your comments, your observations in the chat box, and we will take those up after the panelists have a chance to weigh in. So thank you again, Charbel, and I'm going to call on Gloria now to share her impressions. Gloria, over to you.
Bueno, agradezco sobre todo la invitación para discutir la presentación del informe de Alan y Michael, no solamente por la oportunidad para exponer mis ideas, sino por la lectura del informe que realmente realiza un amplio análisis crítico del trabajo desarrollado por las redes de trabajo con hombres y niños, pero también recoge y sistematiza de manera muy interesante las críticas que el movimiento feminista mismo ha hecho en torno a la consecución de la igualdad de género. En mucho estoy de acuerdo con sus planteamientos desde las complejas interpretaciones conceptuales que sobre el trabajo hacia la igualdad se han hecho, como las perspectivas que han colocado en el centro distintos aspectos de la vida de los hombres y las mujeres. Creo que la orientación psicológica que ha tomado el trabajo sobre los hombres, entiendo que buscó incorporar la metodología feminista, aunque pareciera que no había una clara concepción de esta. Los grupos de reflexión que instrumentaron las feministas posibilitaron de manera clara el que las mujeres pudieran identificar el lugar que ocupaban en el sistema. Y para muchas fue decisivo para involucrarse en la lucha por la igualdad, en formar parte del movimiento, lo que no ha sucedido con los grupos de los hombres. Pero me parece que esta dificultad tendría que revisarse en torno a cómo se ha instrumentado esta metodología, pero no podríamos plantear un dilema en cuanto al uso de una u otra aproximación. Estoy segura de que la perspectiva sociológica es necesaria, pero debería ir acompañada de la psicosocial que impacte el comportamiento de las personas. Si bien los autores reconocen las estrategias políticas que han llevado a que el feminismo coloque en la arena internacional desafíos importantes al sistema, considero también que hay coincidencias entre estos dos sectores de la masculinidad y del feminismo en el trabajo que se ha realizado, porque también se ha colocado en muchas ocasiones a las mujeres y a las niñas en el centro, y en la agenda las problemáticas que se han considerado probablemente más urgentes para ellas y que en ese sentido en muchas ocasiones han perdido también su perspectiva transformadora de la sociedad. Es decir, se atienden problemáticas urgentes, pero no necesariamente implican la búsqueda de herramientas o de estrategias que sacudan al sistema y que realmente logren algunas transformaciones. Coincido también en el reconocimiento de que en el feminismo se han abordado aspectos mucho más amplios de la realidad, como la economía, la justicia, el medio ambiente, entre otros, y construido importantes redes temáticas que enriquecen el análisis y la discusión. No obstante, yo identifico que los recursos disponibles para el apoyo al trabajo feminista se ha centrado en aspectos similares a los mencionados en el trabajo con los hombres, los derechos reproductivos, la violencia, donde un sinnúmero de organizaciones y redes se centran en estos temas. Llama la atención, en ese sentido, el señalamiento de la imposición de una agenda por los intereses del neoliberalismo, ya sea en las reuniones intergubernamentales como en las políticas de financiamiento. Las dos conferencias que se destacan en el trabajo, Cairo y Beijing, muestran precisamente el lugar que los intereses políticos han jugado. La imposición de metas demográficas para todos los países desde la década de los 70, al coincidir con el interés del feminismo por liberar la decisión de las mujeres sobre su reproducción, ha definido una agenda y ruta por décadas. Resulta por lo menos extraño que sea este eje de trabajo, los derechos reproductivos, el central en una agenda de desarrollo, cuando realmente las problemáticas para el desarrollo abarcan un sinfín de dimensiones que muchas veces no son consideradas como prioritarias. En ese sentido, la institucionalización de la política de género que se instrumentó en Cairo con la invitación de los países más poderosos para que se incorporaran las mujeres de manera masiva a los procesos productivos, resultó prácticamente la línea prioritaria de la política de género. Pocos de los países que tenían esa tarea pendiente consideraron el desarrollo de una política que contemplara a las mujeres y a los hombres, a las niñas y a los niños. La incursión de las mujeres a todas las actividades de manera masiva no estuvo acompañada de un cambio en las instituciones que garantizara su participación de manera equitativa y segura. Hoy día, no solo persisten las desigualdades en estos espacios, sino que están también expuestas al acoso y la violencia en prácticamente todos los campos. Yo miro una confusión en torno al concepto mismo de género. En muchos países, hablar de género se refiere a mujeres, sin considerar la complejidad misma del concepto para incorporar las distintas expresiones de género e identidades de género, donde realmente pudiera dar cuenta de la totalidad, de la complejidad por un lado, de la interseccionalidad y la plasticidad que el género mismo nos ofrece. Es decir, reconozco que el género como dimensión es una dimensión compleja que plantea desafíos muy importantes para la instrumentación de una política fina y adecuada que contemple a toda la población. Pero si estamos asumiendo la igualdad de género como un desafío central para la transformación social, no puede hacerse simplificándola, sino realmente buscando estrategias que tomen en cuenta su profunda complejidad. La responsabilidad de los estados y las políticas de género que han priorizado el utilizar la fuerza de trabajo de las mujeres, abriendo espacios para su amplia y creciente participación pero sin tocar las estructuras institucionalizadas desde una perspectiva patriarcal, las coloca hoy como intrusas en esos espacios. Y en ese sentido afectan a los hombres que han hecho esfuerzos por cambiar sus comportamientos y a quienes se les mira todavía hoy como traidores del género. Es decir, el no tener una clara perspectiva de género ha abierto posibilidades para las mujeres, pero colocándolas en una condición de vulnerabilidad, y no solamente a ellas, sino también a aquellos hombres que han buscado realmente acompañar estos procesos, criticando su propio actuar, pero en donde la mirada crítica con respecto a estas transformaciones ha estado pendiente, vigilante, para que eso no suceda. Y ha habido sanciones muy importantes para hombres y mujeres que han buscado desde su propia iniciativa estos cambios en su actuar, en su devenir, en los distintos espacios. Si los acuerdos alcanzados en los espacios intergubernamentales, si bien han incorporado algunas de las demandas de las mujeres y el feminismo, han resultado al final en mayor trabajo, mayor vulnerabilidad y promesas no cumplidas para la mayoría de la población. Se ofreció desde un principio un mejor desarrollo, el abatimiento de la pobreza, y esto no ha sucedido. Los niveles de pobreza siguen en aumento y las mujeres siguen sujetas a un sistema patriarcal. Efectivamente, creo que el trabajo...
Gloria, you have 1 minute.
Yes. Efectivamente, creo que el trabajo con los hombres tendría que ampliar la mirada, diseñar una estrategia de incidencia en distintos espacios y pensar en el análisis y trabajo de hombres de distintos sectores. Buscar el impacto en los espacios de decisión política, pero igualmente creo que es necesario un trabajo articulado con el feminismo que garantice una mirada crítica hacia los logros para que estos efectivamente contribuyan a la transformación social y no a la reedición del sistema. La alianza con otros movimientos sociales es también un pendiente de los desafíos de género, pero no hay posibilidad de alianza si no hay una comprensión clara de los desafíos que esos movimientos enfrentan, que permitan la elaboración de propuestas de trabajo conjunto a partir de la identificación de elementos comunes. Tratar de que ellos incorporen nuestra perspectiva a sus demandas, a su lucha, no es la única vía. Necesitamos encontrar cómo articulamos, cómo tejemos juntos nuevas propuestas. Los desafíos que el panorama mundial hoy ofrece son múltiples y complejos, pero sobre todo urgentes. Y la pandemia ha venido a profundizarlos, evidenciando los vacíos que los estados habían dejado. La economía, el fortalecimiento de la gobernanza y las instituciones, la democracia, el cambio climático, el avance del conservadurismo y el nacionalismo, todos ponen en riesgo los logros que se han alcanzado. Tenemos que encontrar los mecanismos para luchar juntos en una fuerte alianza entre la masculinidad y el feminismo para poder sacudir el sistema en el que hemos estado insertos durante tanto tiempo.
Bravo, Gloria. Thank you so much for your contributions. And you asked some very pertinent questions, including how do we do this work together in accountable ways in the presence of the current challenge. So thank you very much for that. And so I'm going to call on Urvashi now to share her contributions. Urvashi, over to you.
Yeah, happy to be the last person to go on the list. Most has been shared, and I'll try and be brief. So, Alan, and thank you so much for getting me on board for this discussion. When you first shared the topic, I made my own points as to what would it look like. And when I was reading the report, I saw so many places where things just fell into there were so many commonalities, and I appreciate that the report actually brings out some of the fault lines to the conversation, which still exist even after so much of work. Yes, the work around men and boys has been, and the masculinities field has been really has had a good foundation, and it is visible because since Breakthrough is part of the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence, we have seen the language of working with men and boys and working on gender norm change being part of the discussion. So yes, we have made those inroads clearly. And what we now really need to move is how does, and which you've captured in your report, is how do we make the shift from a personal space to a more systemic change, where it's more large scale and we are able to transform norms. And that's what, even the piece around looking at political will, political commitment, and accountability to issues of gender transformation is something that is key to moving forward as well. And systems change is how we'll, and I think a lot of people in the chat as well have referred to it as a way forward of moving along. I think the other reflection which I had was around how the family space, and which I also spoke in our small group discussion, was how the family space needs to generate more intergenerational dialogue. And that's an intervention tactic which a lot of people are now using to have these conversations in spaces where conversations are not possible. Yeah. So even in our family space, if I reflect in India, children don't talk to their parents, and neither do parents have time for their children, right? They go their own way and they have their own thinking about each other. So how do you create spaces where these conversations can happen, and these conversations can happen between various gendered people as well in a room, which are currently not happening. And that's one way of an intervention that we could probably reflect upon, especially since we're looking at the family as a space. I would want to acknowledge something that I mentioned around I think Jean was mentioning around isms and working on isms. A lot of these isms are very closely linked on upholding power structures, and a lot of it is linked to masculinity. So what are the isms that are then transforming the existing power structure is something it will be interesting to just analyze. And that's like a moonshot goal. Probably we can land there in another decade or so. But yeah, some of those thoughts, and I'll pause here because I know that we have other people who would want to share and contribute. But thank you again so much for having me here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Urvashi. Great points. I especially liked your call on us to create more spaces for intergenerational dialogue on this. So thank you, esteemed panelists, for your contributions. Thank you, Jean, Charbel, Gloria, and Urvashi for sharing your review of the paper. Alan and Michael, quickly, would you like to pick perhaps on one or two topics that were raised by our discussants and respond?
I'm looking through my wealth of notes and figuring what comment. Do you want to go first, if you can?
Okay. I mean, yes, I think so. I think the language of beyond the personal, which has been used several times, and we do use in the report, is perhaps not the right language, because we definitely don't want to lose the personal. And I think what we're saying is that we need to think, the personal is structural, right? We need to think the two together and not separate them out. And also be kind of alert to the ways in which a focus on, norms or irresponsible masculinity serves unwittingly to maintain structures of oppressive power, right? So to be alert to the ways in which the focus on the personal in our work has unwittingly served to maintain the structures which we are interested in dismantling by displacing attention onto them. I think the second point about, how do we translate it into practice at community level? I mean, I didn't have time to get into it a lot, but I think there is a key point about if we understand gender transformative work with men and boys to be about transforming unequal relations of power, wherever we're trying to do that work, then it's important to think about the multiple relations of power within which men and women live wherever they are, whatever community they're in. In other words, they're not just gendered relations of power. One of the most striking examples I came across of gender transformation, admittedly on a very short visit, but I think I took away a key point from it, was doing a case study on a social movement called Nijera Kori in Bangladesh, which works with landless communities on land rights. It was in the course of their struggle for land rights in particular communities in Bangladesh that significant changes in women's rights happened. So it was women who were often in the lead of those struggle for land rights, men in kind of, developing their land rights struggles, learned and were pushed to acknowledge women's rights. So we're a community struggling for our land rights, but we cannot be free as a community with those rights if half of our community, i.e. women, are not free as well to be fully equal to men. So when Nijera Kori went into those rural villages in Bangladesh to work on economic justice struggles, they were also working on gender justice. So to see those struggles about unequal power relations, to see them in all their complexity, and in all that complexity there may be different kinds of entry points to work with men. So those are the 2 points that struck me.
Thank you, Alan. Michael, please. Yes, go ahead.
There was so much in the discussant's commentary that I could pick up on, but there was just two little things I wanted to pick up on. One was, I think, Gloria's very valuable reminder that, focusing on gender and the gender inequalities, that men and women are in different places in terms of this work. And we can't expect that men will come to critical consciousness in the way that women have through the women's movements. We can't expect that joining groups and collectively mobilizing as men will mean the same thing. And indeed, there are serious political risks in simply trying to imitate some of those processes and structures in work among men. And so in a sense, I think what brings that home is thinking, for example, about anti-racist politics and what it might mean for white people to organise. That, I think thinking in those terms quickly makes us more aware of some of the real risks of members of a privileged group, or at least privileged on the axis of gender, organising and being organised. So I think that, this work is complicated, and I think we're all aware of that in valuable ways. The other thing I wanted to mention was, I can't remember who commented, but it was about, I mean, it was Charbel, about translation. And I think what Alan and I really need to do is also do the translation work with this piece, and to think about what NGOs and advocates and others really can take in terms of the practical difference this makes to the work we do and the agendas we set and the language we use and so on. So I'm keen, I'm sort of enthusiastic about doing some of that translation work precisely to contribute to our social change efforts.
Thank you very much, Michael and Alan. And one other thing I think that we need to think about in terms of applying these concepts to our work is how do we do that across generations? And in particular, how do we start working with very young boys and start introducing these concepts, not just in terms of helping them understand gender stereotypes and so forth, but how do we build, how do we inspire, motivate the new generation of boys and young men to take on this broader advocacy work? So more food for thought for us practitioners and for academics as well, to work together and further clarify and create some really good, new, effective, accountable, transformative frameworks. So our time is coming to an end, but perhaps before we wrap up, I'll take up a couple of other comments. They've been so rich. There's so many of them in the chat box, and we are capturing those comments, so keep them coming, and perhaps we can share it back with all of you. Just a few more. We believe that there is not yet a critical mass of men who question themselves and question in favor of gender equality, in contrast to the massification of the feminist movement. So that point has been made. There are some fields of study through institutions of masculinities from universities that have been giving some legislative and legal discussions, but in general, there's a great confusion on the part of men of the place they occupy in the middle of explosion of the feminist movement in the streets, for example, in Argentina. In relation to Michael's question to Alan, risk of working across movements is one way forwards to explicitly focus on the patriarchal masculinity of hegemony as the common enemy. That is a question. So in response to the question on queer, it has a number of meanings related to sexuality and gender, from narrowly meaning gay or lesbian, or referring to those who are not heterosexual, to referring to those who are either not heterosexual or not cisgender, those who are LGBTQ. So I think that's in regards to a question on the meaning of the term queer. Broadly speaking, our group really enjoyed the presentation and reflected on its pertinence, particularly around politicizing masculinities, the hegemony of masculinity, and the dangers of co-option by neoliberal conservative agendas. One suggestion was the need for intergenerational dialogues as a key for movements towards gender justice and gender transformation, and the need to integrate this as a key strategy of the field. So this is something that Urvashi pointed out in her review as well. A final couple comments here. In Sierra Leone, to transform theory to practice would involve, among other forms of intergenerational and interreligious and intertribal dialogue, but one pitfall would be that sometimes in the field, an ally can become an enemy. Wow. So the engagement with faith communities as an important entry point here. In some sectors, there has been great success in working towards a built environment methodology that is more about these kinds of structural changes that is called for in this report at both community and organizational levels. What would a gender-just environment look like? What are the elements of a gender-just environment? What are the efforts to effectively and strategically build those elements? What is the role of masculine identified folks to work towards work in this building? And finally, in Malaysia, caregiving work is still overwhelmingly seen as women's work. We don't have legally mandated paid paternity leave compared to paid maternity leave that has increased from 60 days to 90 days. The pushback for men to be involved in caregiving is unfortunately led by the Malaysian Employees Federation, who sees it just as a cost to business. So lots of resistance still, lots of backlash, but lots of hopeful engagements as well. Michael and Alan, final words. We've got 3 minutes left. One final point that you'd like to share with the audience.
Well, Laura and Yurka have very kindly pasted the link to that Bangladesh case study in the chat box, so people can access it there. My final comment would be, we need this work now more than ever. You know, the growth of men's rights activism in different parts of the world, the mobilizing of misogyny for different political projects, the backlash that is ongoing and in some cases increasing. So, you know, we need to be doing the work, we need to be reflecting on how we can do it better, and I look forward to continuing that conversation.
Thank you all for your thoughts and comments and so on. There's obviously much more we could explore, and such a richness of insight and experience, in effect in the room. But I do think this report is so timely. It's well timed for kind of where this field is at. And I think if Alan's and my report and this discussion can prompt a kind of some kind of critical rethinking and reshaping of the work we do, so that it's more strongly oriented towards systemic and structural transformation, then that would be wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael, Alan. Thank you, everyone. It's been a great dialogue, and there's clearly a ton of work ahead of us, and lots of opportunities for transformational change. It's good that we're looking inwards and outwards. It's good that we're being critical about our approaches, and it's wonderful. We need to be committed to growth, to learning from past experiences, to build on things that have been successful, and there's a tremendous opportunity for us to do that in, again, an accountable, diverse, transformative way, without losing sight of our end goal, which is a gender justice future, racially justice future, a LGBTQ inclusive future, and a transformational future for all of us. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael and Alan, for writing this amazing report. Thank you, UN Women, for supporting that amazing work. Thank you, MenEngage Ubuntu organizers, for bringing us together. And thank you, Asa, Alan, Michael, Jean, Charbel, Gloria, Urvashi, for your great contributions and participation in today's session. And to all the participants, stay in touch, stay connected. We have a ton of other really engaging sessions in the coming 7 months. So from my side, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Global MenEngage, on behalf of White Ribbon, on behalf of MenEngage Alliance, thank you all, and see you next time.